Okay, so first of all, I think we should introduce ourselves because you don't know us yet. My name is Veronica. I run a small dive center on Canary Islands in La Palma, the very small Canary Island. And yeah, I'm an SSI instructor trainer. This is why we offer these courses with SSI. Very easy. There are other agencies with a very comparable content, but for some reason I decided to be with SSI, not because it's the only one, just because it's an agency I work very fine with. And yeah, let Dominic present himself. He is our Punkfish Academy brain, let's say.
So thanks a lot. Yeah. So about me, actually, I sometimes say in my daylight job, but it's not actually a daylight job. It's more or less a nighttime job. I'm an astrophysicist by profession. I work in gamma ray astronomy, and we do observations at extremely high energies, for example, of the surroundings of massive black holes. And our telescopes, those are located on the small Canary Island of La Palma. And that's actually how the paths of myself and Vero crossed a few years ago, because I started like this adventure into diving, and this led, yeah, all the way to becoming an SSI instructor and to now enjoying bringing a bit of knowledge and a bit of insight about diving and theory behind some topics in diving to folks all across the world. And that's why I massively enjoy doing webinars like this one here.
Okay, so let's get directly into what we want to talk about. And today's webinar is about diving in altitude, diving in mountain lakes. Why a webinar about all this? Well, there are some serious changes when we are not at sea level. And for sure, it's okay, you can like just put your settings in your computer on, okay, now I'm at altitude, and that's it. And you will do a safe dive because your computer will lead you out of the water in a pretty safe way. But what we always want is to give a little bit more knowledge about why we have to change the settings and what this change the settings means actually, and what happens with the calculations when we do this. So we want to go a little bit deeper into it. The SSI course about altitude diving is one of the few SSI courses that does not have proper materials. So it's kind of necessary that we sit down and explain everything because you can't just read it. So this is why we decided we design something about this and want to give you like a little overview about how it works to dive above sea level. So we will first have a look at what is exactly changing when we get to a higher altitude. We will have a longer look on the adjusted no decompression limits at altitude and what does it mean to decompress at altitude, because basically what we most do is decompression theory. We do everything that has to do with diving, but everything that has to do with decompression theory is like what we are most interested in. And then we will talk about how do we come back home after diving, what happens when we drive after diving and we drive like higher up the mountains. This is something that does concern us as well, because my dive center here in La Palma is at 700 meters. We dive in the ocean, but after diving we drive up, and for sure this serves as well to explain people why I am sure that this is not dangerous at all. So, what's like just a little bit like to have an idea what people do when they do altitude diving, and that we are not the very first people to invent this. When all the time when people went diving, they have not only been interested in what's happening in the ocean. There was always like a call for higher mountain lakes, and like one of these big and very well-known excursions was one that Jacques Cousteau did in 68 already, so long ago, really long ago. And They went to Lake Titicaca, which is like one of the highest lakes worldwide. It's at nearly 4,000 meters, and it's as well like a very, very deep one. So this is at an altitude where altitude in fact matters a lot, because there we have all the effects of being in a higher altitude and needing to have the time that our body adjusts to this altitude. And then we do have serious changes in decompression, because the pressure at this altitude is a lot different from our pressure, ambient pressure at sea level. So what they did find there are like a lot of stories around this, that they did discover a frog, and this like very interesting, special, strange frog, and lots of them, and big ones, and they were all over. We know a lot about these frogs because they did tell a lot of stories about these frogs, and there was even some science around this. But we did not really know afterwards where exactly they have been and how deep exactly and which gases they did use. But it looks like the frogs were for real and not just anacosis. Unfortunately, these frogs, like a lot of animals, are now very close to extinction. So the ground of the sea is not covered with these frogs anymore, unfortunately. So this is not very important for us because we might not dive like Titicaca. This is very experimental. There are people diving there from time to time, but it's not exactly a common place because this is really, really high. And yeah, because Dominic is the one who has a lot more to do with the altitude, like he's watching even higher than we can travel. He continues at this point.
Yeah, so I mean that's in a way that's true for astronomy. This thin layer, 100 kilometers or so of the atmosphere of the Earth, of course. I mean it's sustaining life on Earth, but it can also be an annoyance when the weather is not good, for example. But we use it also as a detector medium. Actually, that's the way our telescopes work. But let's take a look at this small graphic here. What you see here is in the x-axis, so to the right, that's height above 0, so height above sea level in kilometers. So 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers. And then in the y-axis, that's the pressure, the atmospheric pressure in hectopascals. So 1000 hectopascals would be 1 bar. So roundabout sea level pressure is around about 1 bar. Or to be precise, normally 1013 millibars, but let's keep it at 1 bar for the moment, roughly. Now, what happens is, of course, if we increase altitude, if we move up in this column of air in the atmosphere, we have less and less atmosphere above us, so the pressure, of course, decreases. The atmospheric pressure decreases. And you see already from this red line, that's the atmospheric pressure over height. You see already this line has a similarity to the functions, so to the mathematical curves that we also use in decompression theory. It is actually the same basic mathematical formalism. The trick is that after always a given height, the ambient pressure halves. If you increase your height by 5.5 kilometers, you are at only half the pressure at sea level. If you go up another 5.5 kilometers, you are at a half of a half, so a quarter. If you go up another 5.5 kilometers, you halve it again, and then you are at 1/8 only of the pressure at sea level. Now, 5.5 kilometers, that's already something, right? That's already higher than most bodies of liquid water, because it tends to be quite cold in most regions of the world, and so water would normally be frozen at these altitudes. And thus you get a relatively good approximation. You see that this is not linear, of course, but you also see that at moderate heights, you can approximate this with the linear idea to some reasonable extent. So if we stay in this regime, let's say of up to 3,000 meters or so, and it's mostly what concerns us for diving at altitude, then it's quite okay to say that for every 1,000 meters we gain, the ambient atmospheric pressure decreases by 0.1 bar. And you see, like, of course, 5.5 kilometers, that would be like decrease 5 times by 0.1 bar, and then you add half a bar roundabout by this approximation. So that's not so bad. And that works relatively well. It's called the exact function, the exact exponential function. It's called barometric altitude formula, if you want to look it up. But the basic idea is just that you get a height at which you always halve the ambient pressure, scale height. And if you go stepwise, then it goes always down, down, down. Same idea as behind of the half-lives or the half-times of the tissues in decompression theory. This is a type of mathematical formula we find often in nature. So that's the basic idea one should take away from here. It's a good approximation. If you go up at moderate heights by 1,000 meters, ambient pressure decreases by 0.1 bars. Now, of course, sea level sort of 1 bar pressure, that's where most human life and especially most of the biological history of the human species has taken place. So the human organism, it does very fine with the pressure of 1 bar. It does fine, luckily also at higher pressures, else we could not dive. And it also does fine, of course, at lower ambient pressures, otherwise we could not climb high mountains, for example. But same as when we go diving and we feel effects, for example, narcosis from nitrogen, for example, oxygen toxicity when oxygen partial pressure becomes too high. Same, we have to consider also some effects if we decrease the ambient atmospheric pressure too much. There's, of course, trivially one thing, decreasing the pressure means we get less oxygen per breath of air, of course, into our lungs. And that at some point has, of course, biological consequences. So our performance drops. And we can already measure this, feel this, and probably most of you have made this experience, or all of you maybe sometimes in your lives. You can already feel this at 2,000 meters. So if you go to, in Europe, this would be the Alps, but in the US, for example, in the western US, somewhere in the mountain ranges, for example, you easily, of course, reach 2,000 meters of altitude. You already feel that you become short of breath. Climbing a flight of stairs feels like a real exercise. When you lay down still in the evening, you feel that you are breathing faster than at sea level normally. Yeah, that's a very, very normal effect. Maybe you get a bit of a headache, for example, for a few hours. The good news is, of course, the human body is quite versatile. So after a week of adapting to this, normally around about at 2,000 meters, ability to perform is back to baseline or nearly back to baseline. And that's often used, of course, if you climb high mountains, you really take your time, of course, and give your body time. In a way, there is 2 processes that play into this here. One is adaptation. So adaptation means your body does some of the quicker things to just increase breathing rate, for example. And then there is acclimatization that takes longer. And this includes, for example, your body producing more red blood cells. Why more red blood cells? Of course, to more efficiently carry oxygen from the thinner. That takes longer. So that's the acclimatization is like weeks time scale. Adaptation happens relatively fast. And now that's like the biggest challenge already, of course. That's the lower partial pressure of oxygen. And now we see this somehow, this limits, of course, the range of humankind in a way, at least for permanent settlements. We see very high settlements in the Himalayas, for example, also in the Andes in Southern America. But the highest city with more than 1 million inhabitants, so the highest really large city on the planet, it's still La Paz in Peru. And it's at less than 4,000 meters. Of course, other things come into play here. It's cold at high altitudes and so on. But we are relatively limited in that range, relatively limited. But we can do well. And of course, as we have seen at 3,800 meters, also dives can be successfully done. Now, at such altitudes, La Paz, I don't know if any one of you has ever been there. I've not, maybe sometime there comes an opportunity, but I have not been to La Paz as of yet. But of course, to other places in the mountains of similar height. So at such altitudes, when you want to climb a 3,800 meter high mountain, for example, in the Alps, you need a few days of giving your body time. And if you want to recover sort of like your baseline fitness or come close to that baseline fitness, that takes several days or maybe even weeks then. Now, what happens if you don't give your body sufficient time? Unfortunately, it's not only that you feel a drop in performance. There can also be medical consequences. Called this altitude sickness. That's a whole range of symptoms. The headache I mentioned is something that happens, being short of breath. That happens, and unfortunately, this decreased ambient pressure and oxygen partial pressure in interplay, it can also lead to edemas. So volumes of liquid, of body fluid forming in your lungs, which make breathing harder, and also in the brain, which is of course quite dangerous for the central nervous system. This is extreme cases, yeah? And it's not of course what is expected to happen, but it's a reality. I've been a mountaineer most of my adult life. As said, I've climbed mountains even higher than 3,800 meters, as said. And if you're in this community, that's a real topic that happens, and it's not very infrequent. That happens, that people get altitude sickness, and then in extreme cases also these very severe cases of altitude sickness. So that warrants just to be careful. But luckily, of course, for diving normally, don't go to such extreme ranges already. If we do, we have to be considerate and really give the body time for this reason of altitude sickness alone. Okay, maybe flip one forward. Actually, funny is maybe we shouldn't say funny about sickness, but interesting thing is if people get treated against altitude sickness, what does one do? Put this person into sort of like a very low pressure chamber. So normally a pressure tight tent that can be pumped up to a bit higher than ambient pressure, and then flood them like with a higher partial pressure of oxygen. It normally helps. Now, and that's, however, that's not the extremes, of course. You know that the highest mountains in the world, Mount Everest, 8,850 meters, they have been climbed. And they have been climbed, of course, without pressure suits and even without supplemental oxygen. So that's like the utmost range of human performance, at least for very, very few individuals, that reaches up to these altitudes. It's possible to even climb up a mountain to that altitude. But it's long preparation and, of course, not for everyone. But there come real limits. And the first limit is that without supplemental oxygen, sufficient saturation to sustain life can really not be achieved from 13 kilometers onwards. It's also easy in a way to see, of course, because what is the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level? It's of course 0.2 bars roundabout. And now you know that what is the minimal partial pressure of oxygen that we always have to make sure is in our breathing gas. Normally we would probably say like 0.18 or 0.16 or so, because already below that you see a significant drop in performance and increase in risk. But normally we say in diving, if oxygen partial pressure should ever drop below 0.1 bars, that's an immediate danger to life and to loss of consciousness. You know, you see already 13 kilometers, that's really already something. Yeah, that's really a very significant drop. That's 2 of these half-time heights already above sea level, a bit more even. So that's the limit without supplemental oxygen. There comes, however, even if you give people supplemental oxygen, if you supply them with plenty of oxygen, there comes another limit. It's called the Armstrong limit. And that's a quite fundamental limit, and I'd just like to tell this because it has a deep connection to some processes in diving already. This happens at 19 kilometers or 63 hectopascals. And now why 63 hectopascals? Why is this such a really sharp line? It's actually easy to understand. That's the boiling point of water at 37 degrees centigrade. Now 37 degrees centigrade is of course human body temperature. But what happens there, and that's a real opportunity to maybe sort of like tell this, is it's not like you sometimes see in movies or sometimes see written down. It's not like the blood is boiling and the person is dying and agonizing death or so. That does not happen actually. But what happens is that we have volumes of fluid that are at ambient pressure always in our body. for example, the alveolus in the lungs. So in this alveolus in the lungs, we have a thin film of fluid. And we must have, because otherwise they would clump and would not be able to open and facilitate gas exchange. And this thin film of body fluid in the alveolus, it's always at ambient pressure. It has to be. And it's, of course, always at body temperature because it's 37 degrees in the lungs, body temperature. Now, what happens if the ambient pressure drops below this Armstrong limit? Quite easy. This fluid on the surface of the alveolus, it boils. And from this boiling fluid, there comes a stream of expanding gas. And this stream of expanding gas, it pushes away air and with that oxygen from the point of interaction, from the point of gas exchange with the body. So gas exchange in the lungs basically stops at 63 hectopascals, and it stops quite hard. So, and that's the reason why it's not possible without a pressure suit to go higher than this 19 kilometers. And of course, you see here to the right, famous thing, of course, Felix Baumgartner jumped from over 39 kilometers. People can go higher. Of course, people can, in principle, also go to the vacuum of space, but you need a pressure suit then, because otherwise that would really not work for human life. It can be done actually for like seconds or so. People regularly often have survived decompression to 0 bars for like seconds or so, but it's not possible to keep up gas exchange. So loss of consciousness is quite rapid. Actually, even for depressurization of a cabin of an airplane at 12 kilometers altitude, useful consciousness it's very short, seconds to minutes normally. Okay, now what is really the gist of that? What have we to take away from that? First, of course, diving destinations are normally not at such extreme altitudes. Yeah. So what we need is a short adaptation. It's normally not a long acclimatization phase, but we should make sure if we ever come to the point of wanting to dive at 3,800 meters to give the body sufficient time. That's important because then you really need all the red blood cells you can get. Not so much for diving, of course, because you will have higher pressure, higher ambient pressure while the dive is, but for your body to be really able to cope with all that. Now, going back to this drop by 0.1 bar for 1,000 meters, this means, of course, at this 1,000 meters, ambient pressure is 0.99 bar. And that means the absolute pressure already doubles at 9 meters diving depth in water, not at 10. And it triples at 18 meters and so on and so forth. Yeah, because ambient pressure is smaller, doubling and tripling happens at a bit smaller increase in diving depth. That's, I think, easy to understand. And now the connection to decompression theory is that a very, very important parameter is the overpressure of dissolved gases in the tissue compared to ambient pressure. That's a very, very relevant parameter. And we want to avoid too high of an overpressure to avoid bubble formation. And now that immediately means, because the ambient pressure already doubles at 9 meters difference, that immediately means that there must be a change to the gas saturation and desaturation when diving at altitude. Especially it means that there must be shorter no decompression limits because it happens more rapidly, that this decrease happens and that drives your tissues that would be saturated to relatively more critical supersaturations. And that's one thing we will now want to look into in a bit more depth. And I think for that, back to Vero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a little bit, let's get back to some nice pictures. We will get deeper into theory immediately, but just to have an idea about which altitudes are we talking about. It's our initial example of the Lake Titicaca is for sure one of the examples where people don't frequently dive, or it's not that normal. We have a lot of lakes. When we talk about mountain lakes, we most of the time talk about altitudes of 600 meters, 1,000 meters, probably a little bit more. Like the highest I did dive was actually in Lago Atitlan in Guatemala, which is at 1,500, which is already an altitude where you do need to do certain adjustments, and it's deep as well. But there are not very much dives being done at 2,000 meters or more. So in the places where we actually go, we have to adjust a little bit. But just as Dominic mentioned, the important point of, can we go there on one day from sea level and just jump into the water? If it is, if the difference in altitude is not so much, and we already live at, let's say, 400 meter and then drive up to 1,000, we don't need a lot of time to adapt. If we do this long travel and just get there very fast in one day and have like an altitude change of 2,000 meters directly before diving, I guess that most of us would feel tired enough already to decide to take a nap before they actually go diving. So for me, 2,000 meters altitude change is possible, because on my same island, I can just drive uphill to 2,500. But when I get there, I feel this, and I don't really feel like jumping into the water when I get there. So I think if you listen to your body a little bit, this will be fine to do. But then once you are okay, and once you're there at a little bit more altitude, you will want to plan your dives, and you will want to adjust your planning to the altitude where you actually are. So the easiest way of doing it is when you look at a dive table, just whatever dive table you did use in some moment of your life, or whichever dive table you remember, and you can use these tables, but you will use like a theoretical depth for your dive. You will use a correction factor to correct for the lower ambient pressure where you are. And this correction factor is, you take the pressure at sea level divided by the pressure at the altitude where you actually are. That means at a mountain lake of 1,000 meters, around 1,000 meters, we don't care if it's 980 or 1,050, this correction factor would be 1.1. And then you just take the depth where you're actually diving. Like, let's say you dive at 9 meters and you take it times 1.1, and you get the theoretical depth. You get the depth that has the same effect at sea, if diving at sea level. So if you go to 2,000 meters, like a bit higher than this easy-going 1,000 meters lakes, there it would be really visible that when you have this, then that if you're at 2,000 meters, all of a sudden you have just 0.8 bar ambient pressure, and that means that at 8 meter you reach the same effect that you would reach at 10 meters at sea level. And now, if you're not just doing a very shallow dive, but you do something like 24, you are diving at 24 meters, but what happens is that you have the same effect on your body as you would have when diving to 30 meters at sea level. And if you have a look on your tables, you see that the no decompression limit is quite different from 24 to 30 meters. There is kind of a big step. So the easiest way, in case you are working with tables, you could use this correction factor, and you get simply shorter no decompression limits. You calculate with the theoretical depth and go to the depth you were planning to do, and do your dive according to your plan. That's one of the things you can do for sure, but well, I don't know who of us still plans dives with tables. Honestly, I don't do this anymore, and I have not done for a very long time. I have some tables and I show them around when I want to explain something, but they are not very useful anymore. We have two possibilities to plan. We can use our diving computers, which are not very nice for planning because they can just give us the actual no decompression limit on a certain depth and not a full dive plan. But basically, yes, we set our computer to mountain lake mode or to altitude programs, and then the computer will calculate the rest for us. What you see here at the right is, as an example, the PUC computers, the Maris PUC computers. They have just like four settings for altitude, P0 up to 700 meters, which is what we normally use. And which means, like, as long as we are not even over 700 meters, we are in an area that for the computer, for the calculations, does not really count as altitude. And then the level from 700 to 1,500 meters, from 1,500 to 2,400, and then from 2,400 to 3,700, which is where things start to be really complicated. As long as you're like in the P1, P2 level, you can just change your computer setting and you will be fine. Some computers, like Shearwater, which for some reasons I kind of love, does this automatically, because Shearwater just measures the ambient pressure. It really measures it, and when you go higher up a mountain, the computer knows when you start at which pressure you actually are. So you can just put altitude in automatic, and the computer will do everything else for you. This is so much easier than planning your dive with dive tables, that I don't know anyone who would use these tables anymore. When I did my first dives, like in mountain lakes, this Lago Atitlan, they had all these different mountain lake tables adjusted to their altitude, but today, not really necessary. You can as well plan your dives using planning program. So one that I like to use is the Subsurface. It's a free software, so you can just download it and enter your dive data, and it will spit out a proper plan. The advantage of this is that you don't have to assume that you stay the whole dive in one depth. You can just put different levels in your dive plan, and it will just spit you out a nice plan and will give you like an estimation about how your saturation will be on this dive. So normally we would not use this to plan a dive and then forget our computer at home. We will still take our computer, but we will use this kind of planning to have an idea what our computer will tell us. And I love this program actually for the possibility to visualize your tissue saturation. So here, a little excursion into tissue saturation. What you see here is a dive to 30 meters to the no decompression limit, or a little bit shorter than no decompression limit at sea level, 15 minutes, which would be the no decompression limit at 2,000 meters. And then a slow ascent and a safety stop at 5 meters for 3 minutes, and then we actually get out of the water directly. I would not do this dive. I would start to leave the 30 meters a lot earlier and then stay at 20 meters, stay at 10, and get a little bit more time out of this. But well, it's a nice dive, and it's like something good to explain how the difference actually is. So what we see here is the heat map of our 16 tissues, the 16 tissues that are saturating when it's blue. And then when we start to ascend, we have like the upper lines are the faster tissues, intermediate tissues, and then it goes to the very slow tissues. And we see that while we ascend, the faster tissues that are saturated or getting closer to saturation at 30 meters already start to desaturate. And while they are green, they are at like about 20% from the M value, 20% of the limit, or gradient factor 20 for those who heard about gradient factors. And when they get orange, it's like about 40, 60, coming up to 80% of oversaturation, 80% of the M value of the maximum tolerated oversaturation for this tissue. So basically, the darker it is, the higher is the oversaturation. Red is still acceptable. It's not like you don't explode with some red tissues. It's just that the darker it is, the higher is this risk that you might get DCS. Not more, yeah? So what we can see here is this one is this dive at sea level, and the lower one is exactly the same dive at 2,000 meters. And here you see that there is a reasonably higher oversaturation at this point where we actually reach the surface. So we get out of the water with a higher oversaturation after the same dive. This is what we did just explain the whole time, but here it is to visualize a little bit this point. So it means when you plan your dives with this program, you can set it to altitude and just tell the program at which altitude you will be, and it will calculate your atmospheric pressure for you. You don't have to do that. That's nice, really nice. And most of it, usually you will change then the water type to freshwater, because lakes in the mountains tend not to be so salty like the ocean. So this should give you here. I have this detail of the ascent part, like when we actually start the ascent, when we do our safety stop at 5 meters, you can see nicely as well how we start to off gas, because it's getting all this oversaturation is getting a little bit lighter until we do our final ascent from the 5 meters to the surface. And here you see very nicely the difference in the oversaturation on our mountain lake dive and our sea level dive. So what does this mean? I will give this back to Dominic now for the model, but the good news is when these decompression models were empirically tested or were developed, they were developed in Switzerland. And Switzerland it has a lot of mountains, so they did actually test their models in altitude, and that's a good thing to know, and that's like makes the Swiss a little bit sympathetic. So we don't have to change completely the way of thinking decompression just because we're a little bit higher in the mountains.
Yeah, so that's of course, I mean, there is a multitude of decompression models on the market, and you know that not all computers that you use, for example, run the same model, and not all tables inherit their values from the same models. But at least if you venture a bit into technical diving and also advanced recreational diving, normally what you will often see is a Bühlmann model, or ZHL-16 sometimes, as this one of these concrete class of models is called. Of course, going back to Dr. Bühlmann and his teams, who did really a lot of research, as Veronica said, in Switzerland, and also with the explicit interest to understand deep dives and to understand dives also at increased altitudes. And you see, of course, down to the lower right, I don't know if some of you know this small book. That's basically the basis of a lot of that Dekompressionskrankheit. That's his big book, his big works that he published, and to which a lot of what we are doing in technical diving today goes back in a way. Now, they already did validate directly their models. So the model as is, without any changes, up to 700 meters of altitude. So that's already quite a buffer. You can already say, in a way, you can trust this model out of the box without changing settings and so on, up to around about 700 meters. Now, And then, of course, you can say somehow it's again a gradual thing of changes, but you need to rest assured that it's really not like everything breaks down once you move up 100 meters high from sea level or so. That's already, for example, Lake Constance, yeah, where of course a lot of diving takes place in the German-Swiss border. That's already several hundred meters, not 700, but several hundred meters above sea level already. And now, also, there is, of course, some empirical data on altitude exposure, and that includes also flying after diving. On that we will touch later on. And then there is, of course, from the works of Buhlmann and colleagues, there is adapted tables also for much higher altitudes. You see here an example for an altitude bracket of 2,500 to 3,500 meters. So that's already approaching Lake Titicaca in a way, yeah? Okay, one forward, please. Now that's a type of diagram here that you maybe have seen if you have studied a bit decompression fundamentals. I'll guide you through if you have not seen it. It's not complicated. It's a very basic plot that we often use. And what's plotted there to the right, x-axis, is ambient pressure, absolute ambient pressure. So zero means vacuum. And x, for example, would be at 40 meters. If you dive in the Atlantic Ocean, of course, you start at sea level at 40 meters. This x would be 5 bars ambient pressure. 1 bar atmosphere plus 4 times 10 meters, 1 bar each. And in the y-axis, there is inert gas pressure in what we call in decompression theory compartments. So model tissues. These models, they run in the case of this classical ZHL 16, that's the 16 compartments, so 16 different types of theoretical tissues with different half-lives, different speeds with which they on-gas and off-gas, and these speeds, they sort of reflect the perfusion, so how good these tissues are connected to the blood circle in the body. And now in the y-axis here, there is the inert gas, for example, nitrogen pressure in one compartment. Normally we plot what we call the leading compartments of those compartments where the inert gas pressure is closest to the limit that is set from the model. Now we can do dives in this type of a plot. What does a dive look in this plot? If you dive down, you would move to the right. Not, of course, starting at 0, because we normally don't start our dives in vacuum, but starting at 1. That would be this dashed vertical line here. That would be 1 bar. A dive down would just move to the right, because you dive down, ambient pressure increases. But then you know what happens. Also, the compartment inert gas pressure slowly increases. So you then start moving also upwards in the y-axis. And reverse, of course, means if you dive upwards, you move left. And now you see what is the nice thing about this plot is you can draw a line here. And this line, called here a Workman M-value line, a Buhlmann M-value line, those lines, they denote limits, because it's the second thing that models need to do. One thing they do is, of course, describe how tissues on and off gas in the body. And the other thing is they need to set concrete limits onto which overpressures you can risk to have into the tissues. And these lines here, those are the limits set. The Workman line, it's like easy, of course, to guess, goes back all the way to Workman. So person pioneering even long before Buhlmann this type of models. And then, of course, Buhlmann and his team, they sort of invented or installed their own line of limits. And you see already here the trend is now, that's a sketch that's maybe not very precise, but the trend has always been that we have over the decades become more conservative. We always have tended to allow less and less and less supersaturation because we wanted to have less and less accidents, of course. Not like people were any more stable or so 100 years ago. It's just like people 100 years ago had a higher tolerance probably towards accidents in a way. It has to do with diving back then being done, of course, mostly in a military or professional setting where there's sometimes maybe the tolerance for accidents can be higher than if you do this as a hobby. Now, thing is now, why this long story? Thing is, this correction factor estimate that Veronica explained, it does not take into account the tissues at altitude only tolerate a lower supersaturation. So at lower ambient pressure, only a lower supersaturation is allowed, not the same supersaturation. And the good thing you see, however, here, at least for these Bühlmann type models, these MV value lines, they are drawn all the way back to 0 ambient pressure here. Now, does that mean this Bühlmann model will work at the top of Mount Everest? I doubt it. Probably not. Probably not. It's an extrapolation. That's not tested. But at least up to the altitudes of this maybe 3,500 meters that we just said, and it covers the vast majority of any altitude diving we will ever do, we can really trust that this type of model tolerates this extrapolation and will carry us safely also to higher altitudes. So that's not, it's going not into completely untested terrain. It's not going into wild guessing. It's a consistent model, the same type of logic that's behind diving in the range of, say, 1 bar to plus 5 or 6 or 7 bars, just in the other direction for maybe 0.3 bars or something like that. You can really trust that these models work, and a lot of that is already actually empirically validated. It has been tested that this works. Okay. Now maybe, yes, the next thing is, that's all fine and nice. So you can trust your computer that it's running a model that will work at the altitude you will set out to dive. That's fine. But there is, of course, things that go beyond this just calculating the dives that need to be considered. And one of these considerations is the question if pre-saturation is a problem. Now, what does pre-saturation mean? Of course, if you drive up to altitude, you arrive at altitude in a different state than you would be if you would have already been at this altitude for, say, 5 weeks or so, or lived your entire life at this altitude. Why? Because at sea level, your body is in equilibrium. It's saturated to sea level ambient pressure, so to 0.79 bars of nitrogen ambient pressure. That's the equilibrium. You carry this 0.79 bars of ambient pressure, nitrogen partial pressure at sea level, you carry those upwards to lower pressure. So you arrive at the mountain lake in a way a bit supersaturated already. A bit supersaturated already. So the next question, is that a problem? Because normally what we set out to do is, of course, to limit supersaturation. And now we arrive at the start of the dive already a bit supersaturated. If we wait long enough, of course, we come into equilibrium. We off gas. And then, of course, we have this nitrogen partial pressure in all tissues equivalent to the ambient pressure at the altitude. But that wait can be very long if we want to wait for complete equalization. So solutions to that, basically, it's exactly this. Either wait until we are convinced that we really have, for all intents and purposes, reached equilibrium, or to set shorter no decompression limits to pad the margin of safety a bit. And that's a thing that's very hard actually to do quantitatively in a model. One reason for that is, of course, we don't know how fast the drive up will be, for example, for a given person. Yeah? So that's a parameter that's, of course, not easy to implement into a model. Maybe people go up very fast, very steep place. Maybe people go up very, very slowly. And of course, supersaturation will differ. Now, how much difference does this really make? It's, of course, easy to calculate. Comparing 0 meters above sea level and 2,000 meters, as said, at sea level, 0.79 bars, partial pressure of nitrogen. At 2,000 meters, 0.63 bars. Now you already see that's a difference that is limited. Yeah, that's limited. That means, in comparison, that's a difference translated into water depths. That's a different equivalent to about 2.5 meters. Mean like you start a dive at sea level, but your body is already completely saturated to a diving depth of 2.5 meters. So that does not really sound like a lot. And it's actually even better than thinking about a previous very long, very shallow dive to 2.5 meters and then doing a repetitive dive, because from the drive upwards, normally you will really not carry circulating bubbles in your venous system that could then be recompressed and then pass the lung filter and cause all type of havoc and so on. So it's a really not a huge difference and not something that should immediately be a showstopper. It's a comparatively small problem. However, as it is a problem that's very hard to do in a concrete model, because it's so different for different situations, a certain level of planning a bit more conservatively is surely a good idea. That's surely a recommendable idea. Yeah, to cut your margin of safety a bit more, even if you trust the model completely, would be a good idea to not go to the same level of risk you would be tolerating at sea level if you want to have in equivalence the same safety margin. Okay, next one. Yeah, cold. That's for me, right? So I'm like a person freezing very easily, actually, very easily. So for me also 20 degrees centigrade is dry suit territory easily. But you can, of course, for cold, you can do something. You can use warmer equipment. Yeah, you can use dry suit and a thick undergarment and thick hood and so on. But what does it mean, of course, for a dry suit and especially the thick undergarment, of course, to sink, you need more weights. So you will have to carry more equipment, more weight also on dry land. So that's one price that has to be paid, of course, and we know that carrying huge loads, especially after a dive, can be a bit problematic, can increase risk because we increase pressure in the thoracic volume, and by that we can also push bubbles through the lung filter, for example, or push them through shunts in some organs. So that's one thing to consider, and again, a good reason to pad safety a bit. And the other is actually that the risk of decompression sickness indeed also increases completely aside from this consideration about exercise after diving. It already increases the moment you are cold during the decompression phase. So cold when you ascend from the dive, when you desaturate, when you are cold there, your risk increases, and not by a bit, but really significantly. It's easy to understand. Think back what I said a few minutes ago. In these models, and these models, of course, that's theory, but the theory is well grounded in practice. In these models, a decisive thing is how well a tissue is connected to blood, to the circulation of blood. Because blood is what carries away the inert gas if it wants to dissolve out of the tissue. If the connection to the bloodstream is not good of the tissue, this tissue cannot get rid of gas so efficiently by diffusion. And what happens if the tissue cannot get rid of gas and ambient pressure drops? Because it makes bubbles, the gas. So connection to the bloodstream of tissue is a very important parameter for good decompression. And what happens when you become cold, you know that when my hands become cold, yeah, they become literally cold and they become numb. The body limits circulation of blood, especially to the periphery, to conserve warmth, of course. And that can really be a problem, especially if the tissues are warm during saturation on descent and when you are at depth, and then you become cold towards the end of the dive. At desaturation, you are colder, so less connected to the bloodstream than when on-gassing, and that can really cause a problem. You see this here, it's a study that has been done. Go through it slowly. It dives to 120 feet, so already like 40 meters, and roundabout 40 meters. So, and there is series of dives, 1, 3, 4, 2, and so on and so on. That's not important. Important is the thermal condition pair. So the second column here, and C means cold and W means warm. So what happens here? It means dive started cold and then becoming warm. So divers entered the water cold and then got heat supply, so got warm. And of course, the inverse is divers started warm and then got cold during the dive. That's a normal situation. The topmost situation is, I think, quite rare. Or you stay warm during the entire dive, or you stay cold during the entire dive. And now, then there have been dives done to this set 120 feet and for different times. And now, interesting here is the fourth column. And that's the number of DCS cases, so the number of people being bent or the number of dives that resulting in a person being bent, compared to the number of total exposures. And now you see, if you start out cold and you end warm, 0 of 80 dives ended in a person being bent. And 0 of 8 dives of a longer duration, 50 minutes, ended in a person being bent. And even at very long duration, 70 minutes, only 2 of nearly 160, 158 dives resulted in a person being bent. Keep these numbers in mind for a moment. We switch to warm-cold. Already 7 of 32 dives ended in an accident. 4 of 80 dives for 25 minutes still ended in an accident. And that already, this lower scale R here, that means also rejection criterion reached. So already at this moment, they did not go to doing, say, 80 dives or so, because it was just not worth bending more people. It has already been made clear that this is dangerous, that this is a much more dangerous combination than starting cold and going warm. And then you see again that also, like, that's a basic message. If you start out warm, go cold during the dive, your risk of like going into a decompression accident is a major increase. It's a major increase. Yeah, being cold all the time is also not good. You see it here. This cold series 22% is also quite bad. Yeah, so it's not like you can fully compensate for this being cold on this situation by entering already cold.
But this was like at least like the fully cold was on a 60 minutes dive and not on the 30 minutes dive already.
That's true.
So
yeah, that's true.
it is
That's
still
true.
like not a very good idea to be cold during a long and difficult dive. This is a serious dive. I mean, it's a dive out of our normal recreational limits, let's say. But at least this was a long one. And here it's like, even after a very short bottom time, like comparably short, you get the same result as in twice a double as long bottom time when you're completely cold. So,
but you see, like we don't have, I mean, the timing, that's a bit about the studies. It's maybe not, if I would have designed this, probably I would have taken run times that are very similar, but we don't have a 60 minutes cold warm exposure here. But you see that even for 70 minutes, yeah, you have 2 of 158 people, so 1.3% being bent. And here at 60 minutes, you have 22% being bent. So cold is also not a good idea, I would say, from this study. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, it need not take us by surprise, of course, because cold is basically not possible for you, right? If you are cold, then your circulation goes down, always more down. It's not like the body says, okay, I'm cold, I won't go colder. That's not how it works for most of us, yeah. Yeah, so that's, I think, an important message. Staying warm during decompression is vastly important, and that's also important, of course, if you dive in the mountains, because they're normally, apart from being lower ambient pressure, tends to be colder than at sea level. Okay, that's about this.
Yes. So back to what to do after the dive. So let's guess we did take a heating for our dry suit and did do a very nice and very comfortable dive. And then after the dive, we have to get back home. So what happens when we are in the mountains? A lot of time it happens that to get away from this nice little mountain lake, we have to drive even a little bit higher than where we have been already. So we have to cross a pass to come back to our hometown. That's very normal. It's not always like this, but it's a very typical situation. And well, yes, if we are out of the water completely saturated or kind of very saturated, and we go to an even lower ambient pressure, this is again a little pressure change. But then there started like, but normally it's not that much of a difference that it is a big issue. So for a very long time, it was considered that if you drive up like 2,000 more meters after an hour after diving is something that is just okay. So we have desaturated already enough that we can start our ascent up. But, well, in some moment, out came some down recommendations about flying after diving. And, well, flying is not the same as driving up, but here it states that flying at cabin altitudes of 2,000 to 8,000 feet, which is about 600 to 2,400 meters, is what should be considered like flying, and what should be considered with a longer surface interval after diving. So up comes a little bit of a discussion if driving up is exactly the same. And, well, no, it's not, because there are kind of in this example, they set this big margin of altitude from 2,000 to 8,000 feet, which very likely has to do with US regulations, like what is an allowed cabin pressure. It does not mean that airplane cabins are usually pressurized to this. The most common is something around 2,000 meters, so not 600. And the 2,000 does make a little bit of a difference, but it doesn't mean we really can't do this after diving. But 2,000 meters of difference is something I would start to think about. I would start to think about how my dive has been, and if I really want to do that much of a pressure difference after this dive. But in general, if you drive up a mountain, this is different from flying because there is no fast ascent. Like when a plane starts, it does give you quite a fast pressure change, while driving up is the slowest thing you can ever do. And in case you have any symptoms when driving up, well, you can turn around and drive to the next hospital, right? You're not in a plane for the next 10 hours. So you have all the possibilities to react. This is why altitude is just not the same as flying. And you don't really need to consider this flying after diving rules if you drive up a little bit, because it is not the same. But yeah, you should consider if you already want to drive higher up, or if you want to give yourself a little bit a longer break. So there are people who, different from us normal recreational divers, do some combinations of diving and altitude. So, for example, a plane picks them up after diving and they do fly higher. What do they do? If we have this US Navy tables, which is not exactly what we would use for our recreational dives, but it's interesting information to see how they consider the risk, because they don't want to ruin their people neither. It's not that they want to have people getting sick all the time just because they fly them out after a dive. So what do? They have this groups, these repetitive groups, which, for example, after a dive to 90 feet, which is 30 meters, and you go to the no decompression limit of 30 minutes, you would then be in group H, means you have already some nitrogen in your body. So with group H, you have this table here, which shows you which altitude increase are you able to do after what period of time, and up to 3,000 more feet, which is 1,000 more meters, they say, oh, you don't need a break. And just when it gets to 4,000 feet, 1,300 meters, it starts with an hour of break to get to 5,000, 3 hours of a break. And really, just for 8,000 feet, which is nearly 3,000, which is 2,800, 2,700 meters, there it comes close to this 12 hours that are the recommendation for a single no decompression dive as a wait time before you fly. So there are just that not everything that you do after diving, not every altitude change is the same like flying. We don't have to adjust to this table. This is the US Navy, and they can they do things that are a little bit more risky than what we would consider a good idea. As you have seen in this experiment they did with getting colder when you dive, cold and decompression, they do these experiments where people do actually get symptoms of DCS to find out what is safe. But well, the result of this is that a lot of people can dive safer, so we're happy they do it. But we would not do the same when we dive for fun. Well, so no, we can drive uphill after a dive, even when we are reasonably saturated. In our example, like the place where we are, we drive up to our town of Fuencaliente, and driving up the 700 meters is a pressure change that is equivalent to getting up another 0.7 meter of water column. And then we drive up so slow that we get to an essence of an equivalent of 2 centimeters per minute, which is very slow and really allows tissues to keep desaturating very nicely. And that's the same when you get out of the water and you have to go up and then you come down to the town where you're living again. You drive uphill for a very short time, and then you come back to a lower ambient pressure again. And this will not highly affect you.
The 2 centimeters per is translated to water column, of course. I
Yeah.
mean, I've often driven cars where this 2 centimeters might have been also in atmosphere, but it was meant translated to water column. Yeah, that's.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Okay. Let's get it. So, and yeah, then we have like one last little thing about altitude, and this is that very often, or we read this, I don't know if this is a very typical German thing or if you read it somewhere else as well, but it happens really frequently here, really a lot, that when someone drives uphill after a dive and then gets DCS, what does happen? Yes, it does happen. Then people come and say, okay, for sure this person got banned, for sure this person got DCS because he drove up so high after the dive. And as everyone knows, we have to wait 12 hours before we fly, or 24 hours before we fly. We cannot drive up to 300 meters to 600 meters to whatever after diving. And if you get banned, this is because you drove up this hill. Well, no. Definitely no. There is no way that after a dive to 30 meters to an ambient pressure of 4 bar, just this little 0.07 bar pressure change is the pressure change that causes any DCS. It's just, it cannot be like this. But maybe there is still a risk in driving uphill. And there are 2 points where this can be important. These are how bubbles develop after diving and how DCS symptoms actually develop after diving. So when we have a look on a big number of dives where after the dive there were actually bubble grades taken on persons, and it was like that was meant to find out how bubbles develop after the dive. None of this had actually DCS, so we just know something about the bubbles, not about actual cases. But this is from like around 900, more than 900 divers who were tested after just random normal recreational dives. And they were tested directly after the dive, and then like 15, 30, 45, 60, 75 minutes after the dive. And what you can see here very nicely is that the amount of bubbles increases in the first half hour after the dive and like reaches a peak after 30 to 45 minutes. And just then the bubble count starts to decrease again. And this is a very common observation in a lot of different scientific studies. We don't come out of the water with a lot of bubbles. We have a lot of bubbles just half an hour later when we have them. Not everyone, not after every dive, yeah? But like the highest risk of having bubbles is like half an hour after the dive. And now this means that if if in this moment, half an hour after the dive, when you already have bubbles, you decrease the pressure a little bit more, for sure the bubbles that you have will grow a little bit. Normally, this is not a problem at all. But like if you were just at the edge between you get DCS and you don't get it, like if the glass of bubbles was like already full at sea level, and then you drove up this 1,000 meters, this could be this tiny little drop that makes the glass like that makes the water get out of the glass. Yeah, so it's not exactly a problem to drive uphill after diving, but when you did some very serious dives and you think you might be kind of pretty close to the limit, or you already probably feel a little bit weird, then it might be a good idea to just take a short break or a little bit a longer break at sea level. But it's just this tiny little drop. It's like after 80% of our very normal dives, there are normally like 80-90%, there are no bubbles at all. And it's just the very much more serious dives where this happens. But then the other point is, when do symptoms actually happen? And we have like a big amount of DCS happens in the first hours, like even in the very first hour, depending on the different manuals, you have like something between like 60, between 42 and 60% that happen already in the first hour. And then in the first 2 hours, it gets up to something around 60 to 70%. And in the first 3 hours, we get results of like 80%. So most DCS cases get visible in the first hours. Very likely even a little bit faster, because this is the time until people actually realize they have something. And it takes some time from feeling the first symptoms to showing up and telling someone that there might be something wrong. So you can expect that if you drive uphill an hour after a dive, and if something went wrong through this dive, if this is the day where you get DCS, it will actually happen very likely while you drive uphill. But that does not mean it has something to do with driving uphill. It's just that, yeah, if you already have symptoms, it might be that they don't get better from releasing the pressure even more. So there might be this very, very small, tiny risk we have to take into account. And that means, like, yeah, we we don't really have to worry too much about it. But it's kind of when you know you will change altitudes after diving, and when you know you did change altitudes before diving, and when you know there is a bit of an additional risk as well for driving up and not being really adapted to this altitude, then just keep your profile a bit more conservative. 1 second. Then if you did dive that where you got like close to your limit, so for me this would mean when I do very long decompression dives, very long technical dives, when I come out of the water with a big supersaturation, I do stay at sea level for at least a nice drink somewhere. It's nice as well. So there's nothing against hanging around after the dive, chilling a little bit at sea level before you actually drive up, because as well it gives you the chance to just wait and see if everything is really okay, or if not, you can organize for what you want to do. And if you know you will fly after diving, it's always good to have a good night's sleep before you fly. Well, yes, for sure, but not necessarily but it's not really important if you have a 23 hours break or a 24 hours break. It doesn't make so much of a difference. And then the most important thing, if something goes wrong, if something happens, well, it can happen at sea level, it can happen as a mountain lake, it can happen after a deep dive, it can happen after a shallow dive, it can just happen because you went diving, and it's not very frequent. And diving is still a very, very safe sport. There are a lot less diving accidents than accidents when bowling, for example, or hiking up mountains like mountains are. Mountains kill you way more than diving.
Downhill skiing.
Huh?
Downhill skiing, driving a race car.
Oh, yes. Driving a normal car, you know, driving to
Driving
the
a
dive
normal.
site.
It depends, yeah.
I mean, you had more accidents just driving than diving, so
Yeah, that's actually true. I've had I've never had a diving accident, but I had an unpleasant car accident. Yeah, that's true. This year,
with diving tanks included. So
yeah.
well, so it's like let's treat this DCS thing just as we treat other sports as well and other accidents as well, as something that can happen. And if it happens, we treat it, but we don't search for the reason. It's not like, hey, you for sure you got this because you drove uphill. You got this because you were 2 meters deeper than you planned or whatever. No, we don't know why it happened. It just happened. It's fine. We treat it. And if you want to consider to set more conservative limits afterwards, well, do it. Might be a consideration, but maybe it's not even necessary, because maybe it just happened like any accident that happens.